Chicago, 1925. The city of broad shoulders, they called it. A city of steel mills and stockyards, of immigrant dreams and American ambition. But beneath the surface of this gleaming metropolis, another power was rising. Not in the marble halls of City Hall, not in the mahogany offices of elected officials, but in the smoke-filled back rooms of speakeasies, in the blood-stained alleys of the South Side, and in the ledgers of businesses that existed only on paper. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. You know him as Al Capone, Scarface, public enemy number one. But those labels don't tell you the real story. They don't explain how a man with no political title, no official authority, and no legal mandate became more powerful than the mayor, more feared than the police commissioner, and more influential than any elected official in Chicago's history. This isn't a story about gangsters and gun battles, though there were plenty of both. This is a story about power in its purest form, about how one man built an invisible government that controlled a major American city without a single vote being cast in his favor, about how Al Capone became the shadow mayor of Chicago, ruling an empire that generated over $100 million a year in today's money, all while never holding a single public office. Welcome to the untold story of how Al Capone controlled Chicago. To understand how Capone controlled Chicago, you first have to understand what Chicago was in the 1920s. This wasn't just any American city. This was a powder keg wrapped in a promise, a place where fortunes were made overnight and lives were lost just as quickly. The catalyst was Prohibition. When the Volstead Act went into effect on January 17, 1920, it didn't eliminate America's thirst for alcohol. It just eliminated the legal ways to satisfy it. And in Chicago, a city with nearly 3 million people and a culture built around saloons and beer gardens, this created an opportunity unlike anything the criminal underworld had ever seen. But here's what most people miss. Prohibition didn't just create a black market for alcohol. It created a parallel economy, a shadow system that needed its own infrastructure, its own enforcement, its own rules. Someone had to organize it. Someone had to protect it. Someone had to make it run like a legitimate business. That someone was Al Capone. When Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, brought in by his mentor Johnny Torrio, he wasn't the boss. He was just muscle, an enforcer with a talent for violence and a quick mind for numbers. But Capone understood something that most gangsters didn't. The key to real power wasn't just controlling the streets, it was controlling the system. Think about it. A mayor has power because citizens accept his authority. A police chief has power because officers follow his commands. But what happens when you create a system where people need you more than they need their elected officials? What happens when you can provide what the government can't or won't provide? That was Capone's genius. He didn't try to overthrow the government. He made himself indispensable to it. By 1925, when Torrio retired after nearly being killed in an assassination attempt, Capone inherited an organization that was already formidable. But what Capone did next transformed it from a criminal gang into something Chicago had never seen before, a corporate empire that operated like a government, a shadow administration that rivaled the official one in power and exceeded it in efficiency. Capone divided Chicago into territories, each controlled by a lieutenant who reported directly to him. He established courts where disputes were settled, not by judges in robes, but by arbitrators who understood that the cost of disorder was too high for everyone. He created an enforcement arm that was more effective than the police at maintaining order in the neighborhoods under his control. He even established a crude welfare system, providing food, coal, and money to the poor during the depths of the Depression, earning loyalty that no politician could buy.
But the real brilliance of Capone's invisible government wasn't its structure, it was its integration with the visible one.
Here's a question that nobody asks. How does a criminal organization operate openly in a major American city? How does Al Capone run breweries, distilleries, and gambling houses without being shut down? How does he orchestrate violence on the streets without being arrested? The answer is simple, and it's the key to everything. Capone didn't control Chicago in spite of the government. He controlled Chicago because of the government. Let me paint you a picture of how deep this went. In 1927, a survey conducted by the Illinois Crime Survey found that in Chicago there were over 10,000 speakeasies operating openly. 10,000. The police knew where they were. The politicians knew where they were. Everyone knew. But they stayed open because the system that was supposed to shut them down was the same system that depended on them staying open. Capone understood that every man has a price. Not always money, though money usually worked. Sometimes it was political support. Sometimes it was protection for their own indiscretions. Sometimes it was simply the fear of what would happen if they didn't cooperate. Capone mastered all of these currencies. Start with the police. The average Chicago beat cop in the 1920s made about $30 a week. That's it. $30 to support a family, to pay rent, to survive in a city where the cost of living was climbing every year. Now imagine you're that cop, and a well-dressed man approaches you. He's polite, respectful. He tells you that if you look the other way when you pass a certain establishment, you'll find an envelope with a week's salary in it waiting for you every Friday. And if you don't, well, the man doesn't threaten you directly. He just mentions that it would be a shame if your captain heard about that incident last month that you'd rather keep quiet. What do? Most cops took the money. The ones who didn't either transferred to another district or found themselves alone when they needed backup. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just practical economics applied to human nature.
But Capone didn't stop with beat cops. He went higher, much higher. Police captains found themselves on his payroll. Judges discovered that ruling in favor of Capone's interests came with generous rewards, and that ruling against them came with career-ending scandals. Prosecutors who brought charges against Capone's organization found key witnesses disappearing or suddenly suffering from amnesia on the witness stand. The mayor's office? Completely compromised. William Big Bill Thompson, who served as mayor from 1915 to 1923 and again from 1927 to 1931, was so closely aligned with Capone that reformers called him Capone's mayor. Thompson's campaign coffers were filled with Capone's money. His political machine was oiled with Capone's influence, and in return, Thompson ensured that city officials looked the other way while Capone built his empire. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. Capone didn't just buy politicians, he made them. He provided the campaign funds, the muscle at the polls, and the votes, both real and manufactured, that put his chosen candidates in office. In the 1928 Republican primary, Capone's organization was so active in Cicero, a Chicago suburb that served as his headquarters, that the election became known as the Pineapple Primary because of all the bombs thrown at the homes and offices of candidates who opposed Capone's interests. Think about what this means. Capone controlled who got elected. He controlled what they did once they were in office, and he controlled whether they stayed in office. He had created a political machine that operated parallel to, and in many ways more effectively than, the official party machines that had traditionally dominated Chicago politics. This wasn't just corruption. This was a system, a machine, an invisible government running alongside the visible one, and in many ways more powerful than it. But money and fear can only take you so far. To truly control a city, Capone needed something more. He needed legitimacy. He needed people to accept his power not just because they were paid or frightened, but because they believed he deserved it.
November 1930. The Great Depression has Chicago in a stranglehold. Unemployment has hit 30%. Families are being evicted from their homes. People are going hungry in the streets. The government's response has been slow, bureaucratic, inadequate. Bread lines stretch for blocks, and there isn't enough bread to go around. Then something remarkable happens. A soup kitchen opens on South State Street. It serves 3 meals a day, no questions asked, no sermons required. The food is good, there's plenty of it, and it's completely free. Over the course of the next few months, this soup kitchen will serve over 120,000 meals to Chicago's hungry and desperate. Who's paying for it? Al Capone. This is the part of the story that makes historians uncomfortable, because it complicates the narrative. Capone was a murderer, a racketeer, a criminal who built his fortune on exploitation and violence. But he was also, in his own twisted way, a folk hero, and he cultivated that image with the skill of a modern public relations expert. Capone understood something that few criminals before or since have grasped. Public opinion is power. If people see you as a monster, they'll support anyone who promises to destroy you. But if people see you as a provider, a protector, even a kind of Robin Hood figure, then anyone who tries to bring you down is fighting not just you, but the community that depends on you. So Capone became visible, not in the way criminals usually are, through perp walks and mugshots, but as a public figure. He wore expensive suits, custom-tailored in fabrics that cost more than most people made in a year. He drove luxury cars. He was photographed at sporting events, shaking hands with celebrities, attending the opera. He gave interviews to newspapers where he presented himself as a businessman, simply providing a service that people wanted. "I make my money by supplying a public demand," he told one reporter. "If I break the law, my customers, who number hundreds of the best people in Chicago, are as guilty as I am. The only difference between us is that I sell and they buy. Everybody calls me a racketeer. I call myself a businessman." This wasn't just bragging, it was strategic messaging. Capone was reframing the narrative, positioning himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman operating in a marketplace created by bad government policy. And a lot of people bought it.
Why? Because for many Chicagoans, Capone delivered where the government had failed. His speakeasies provided entertainment and social gathering places at a time when prohibition had criminalized normal social behavior. His gambling houses offered the thrill of possibility to people whose lives had been reduced to gray drudgery by economic hardship. His soup kitchens fed people who were starving, while government bureaucrats argued about eligibility requirements and budget allocations. In the neighborhoods where Capone operated, there was order. Oh, it was enforced with brutality when necessary. If you crossed Capone or interfered with his business, you might end up in the Chicago River with concrete shoes. But if you played by the rules of his shadow government, you were protected. Petty crime was lower in Capone's territories than in other parts of the city, because independent criminals knew that operating there without permission would result in a visit from Capone's enforcers. Capone also employed thousands of people, directly and indirectly: bartenders, drivers, accountants, guards, distillery workers. In a time when legitimate jobs were scarce, Capone was one of the city's largest employers. Families depended on Capone's organization for their livelihoods. You want to understand why witnesses wouldn't testify? Why communities wouldn't cooperate with law enforcement? This is why. Bringing down Capone meant destroying the economic foundation of entire neighborhoods. There's a story that illustrates this perfectly. In 1931, during the height of the Depression, a Chicago newspaper reporter asked people on the street what they thought of Al Capone. The responses were shocking. Some called him a hero. Many said he'd done more for Chicago's poor than any politician. One elderly woman said, "He's a better man than the mayor. At least Capone keeps his promises." Was this accurate? Of course not. Capone was a ruthless criminal who murdered rivals and corrupted every institution he touched. But perception is reality in politics, and Capone had shaped the perception masterfully. He had made himself necessary, even beloved by a significant portion of the population. This is what made him truly dangerous to the establishment.
You can arrest a criminal. You can prosecute a gangster. But how do you fight someone who's become a folk hero? How do you prosecute someone when half the jury pool thinks he's done more good than harm?
February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day. 7 men are lined up against a wall in a garage on North Clark Street. They're members of the Bugs Moran gang, rivals of Al Capone's organization. Men in police uniforms enter. The victims assume it's a raid. They face the wall, hands up, expecting to be arrested. Instead, they're machine-gunned to death in a massacre that will become the most infamous mob killing in American history. Capone was in Florida when it happened. He made sure he had an airtight alibi. But everyone knew who was responsible. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was Capone's message to anyone who challenged his authority. This is what happens when you refuse to acknowledge who runs this city. But here's what you need to understand about Capone's use of violence. It wasn't random. It wasn't excessive. It was surgical, strategic, and always in service of a larger goal. Capone used violence the way a government uses its military, as the ultimate enforcement mechanism for his authority. In Capone's Chicago, there were rules, clear rules. If you were in the liquor business and you weren't with Capone, you paid him a tax. If you ran a gambling operation, you kicked up a percentage to the organization. If you were a politician and you took Capone's money, you stayed bought. If you were a cop on the payroll, you looked the other way. Break these rules and the consequences were swift and brutal. But follow them and you could prosper. This predictability was crucial. It's what separated Capone from common thugs. He wasn't interested in chaos. Chaos is bad for business. He wanted order. His order. The St. Valentine's Day massacre, for all its brutality, was an outlier. Most of Capone's violence was more subtle, a beating here, a bombing there, just enough to maintain discipline and remind people who was in charge. The threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself.
Capone also understood the importance of controlling information about violence. He had reporters on his payroll who would spin stories his way or bury them entirely. Police reports could be altered. Witnesses could be convinced to forget what they saw. This control of the narrative meant that even when violence occurred, Capone could shape how it was perceived and whether anyone would be held accountable. But there was another aspect to Capone's use of force that's often overlooked. He created stability. Before Capone consolidated power, Chicago's criminal underworld was chaotic. Different gangs fought over territory constantly. Bombings and shootings were common. Innocent people got caught in the crossfire. Business owners were extorted by multiple gangs, never knowing which payment would actually protect them. Capone ended that. Under his rule, there was one authority, one organization. If you paid Capone, you were protected from everyone else. No other gang could shake you down. No rival could bomb your establishment. It was almost like paying taxes to a government in exchange for police protection, except the government you were paying was Al Capone's organization. This is why many businesses actually preferred dealing with Capone. It was simpler, more predictable. One payment, one contact, and you knew where you stood. In his own twisted way, Capone brought order to chaos. The violence he did employ served multiple purposes. It eliminated rivals and obstacles. It enforced discipline within his organization. It sent messages to others who might consider challenging him. And it demonstrated strength, which, in the world Capone inhabited, was the ultimate currency. But Capone was careful never to let violence spiral out of control. The St. Valentine's Day massacre backfired precisely because it was too brazen, too shocking. It brought unwanted federal attention and turned public opinion against him. After that, Capone became more careful, more controlled. The violence continued, but it became quieter, more deniable.
By 1929, Al Capone stood at the height of his power. He controlled Chicago's underworld completely. He had politicians, police, and judges in his pocket. He was a celebrity, a folk hero to some. His organization was generating an estimated $100 million a year. He lived in a mansion in Florida, dressed in $1,000 suits, and seemed untouchable. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems, and they were converging in a way that would ultimately destroy his empire. The first problem was that Capone had become too visible, too famous. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had made him a national figure, and not in a good way. Suddenly, bringing down Al Capone wasn't just a local law enforcement issue, it was a federal priority. President Herbert Hoover himself reportedly said, "Get Capone." The Department of Justice created a special unit to do exactly that. The second problem was that the methods Capone had used to build his empire couldn't protect him from every threat. He had corrupted local law enforcement and political structures, but federal agencies were harder to compromise. The FBI, the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, they operated outside the Chicago political machine. They couldn't be bought as easily, and they didn't care about local politics. The third problem, and this is the one that ultimately brought him down, was taxes, or rather, the lack of paying them. Capone had been brilliant at avoiding prosecution for his actual crimes. Witnesses disappeared or refused to testify. Evidence vanished. Juries were intimidated or bribed. Local prosecutors were on his payroll. But there was one vulnerability he hadn't adequately addressed. He had never filed a tax return.
Think about the irony here. Capone controlled a criminal empire worth tens of millions of dollars. He had corrupted every level of Chicago's government. He had literally gotten away with murder, multiple murders. But he couldn't avoid paying taxes on income he claimed didn't exist. The Treasury Department, led by Eliot Ness's famous Untouchables team and IRS investigator Frank Wilson, built a case against Capone not for bootlegging, not for murder, not for racketeering, but for tax evasion. They traced his spending, his assets, his lavish lifestyle. They interviewed his suppliers, his accountants, even the merchants he bought from. Slowly, methodically, they built an ironclad case that Capone had substantial income and had paid no taxes on it. On October 17, 1931, after a 3-week trial, Al Capone was found guilty of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion at that time. Appeals failed. Legal maneuvering failed. For the first time in his adult life, Capone couldn't buy, threaten, or scheme his way out of trouble. He served his sentence first in Atlanta, then in the newly opened Alcatraz, the federal prison designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals in a place where corruption and escape were impossible. By the time he was released in 1939, his health destroyed by untreated syphilis and his mind deteriorating, his empire had crumbled. Other gangsters had carved up his territories. The politicians and police he'd corrupted had found new masters or been swept away by reformers. The invisible government he'd built had collapsed without him to hold it together. Capone died on January 25, 1947, in his Florida mansion, his mind gone, his empire a memory. He was 48 years old.
So how did Al Capone control Chicago without running for office? Let's pull it all together. He built a parallel government that provided services the official government couldn't or wouldn't provide. He corrupted every level of the existing power structure, from beat cops to mayors. He used violence strategically to enforce his authority while maintaining enough order to keep businesses running and money flowing. He cultivated public support by positioning himself as a man of the people, a provider and protector in hard times. And he understood that real power doesn't come from a title or an election. It comes from controlling resources, shaping perceptions, and making yourself indispensable. Capone's Chicago was a city with two governments, the one people voted for and the one they actually depended on. The mayor had authority, but Capone had power. The police had badges, but Capone had enforcement. The politicians had titles, but Capone had control. This is the dark lesson of Al Capone's rule. Democratic institutions are only as strong as the people who staff them and the public that supports them. When those institutions are corrupted, when public officials can be bought or intimidated, when citizens are so desperate that they'll accept protection from a gangster rather than help from their government, then the door opens for someone like Capone to walk through. Capone didn't overthrow the government of Chicago. He didn't need to. He just made himself more necessary to more people than the government was. And in doing so, he became the invisible king of America's second-largest city, ruling an empire without ever running for office, without ever winning an election, without ever holding legitimate power. The shadow he cast over Chicago lasted for over a decade. The methods he pioneered, the system he built, influenced organized crime for generations. But his ultimate legacy might be this cautionary tale. In a democracy, power flows from the consent of the governed. But that consent can be bought, coerced, or manipulated. And when it is, when the distinction between the government and the criminals becomes blurred, everyone loses. Except, for a time, men like Al Capone. That's the untold story of how Al Capone controlled Chicago. Not with votes, but with vision. Not with elections, but with economics. Not with democracy, but with domination. He became the most powerful man in Chicago by understanding that real power doesn't need a ballot box. It just needs opportunity, organization, and the willingness to do what others won't. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into Capone's invisible government fascinating, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to this story, so many more secrets in the Capone files, and I'm just getting started uncovering them.